Morning class. Checking in. I want to just put some finishing touches on our conversation today. We're looking late at chapter 15 and essentially how different regions of the world were forced to respond or how they came to grips with the Industrial Revolution that is starting to ripple with greater intensity out of Great Britain first and then Europe as a whole. Soon to follow will be the United States, but for the most part, Europe is going to start to transform global trade patterns. And earlier this week, we spent a little time looking at how China had once been the driver of events in global trade. And today's story, among other things, will be that of how China lost its hold. And much of this I've talked about in class, so I'm going to skip through it. This is primarily for the benefit of the students who were in class today. And we talked a little bit about the Qing in China. We talked about some of the developments that were happening during their few centuries of power, I guess 2.5 centuries of power in China. Challenges that posed themselves to Qing leadership. And most of our day we spent talking about the Opium Wars and how this was essentially the beginning of the end for Chinese power and control of global trade patterns. And the Opium War itself came into being. I mean, the underlying cause was probably the Industrial Revolution, but also there were specific problems and, I guess, cultural disagreements and cultural conflicts between the Chinese and the British that were also aggravating factors in the case of the Opium Wars. So the structure of today's lesson was to look at the Opium Wars from a few different levels, actually 4 different levels. I call this an interdiscovery, meaning that we want to notice that the Opium War was not just a political conflict, it was also a health issue. It was also a opportunity for the industrial north to show some of its technological advance. Also, the events of the Opium War transformed the political arrangements and the access that the British and other European countries had in China as a result of this tense period. So let's get down to business. Our 4 areas of focus will be the economics of the Opium War, the health of the Opium War, the military character and how the battles were carried out during the Opium War, and then finally some of the political transformations that resulted from it. And we talked a little bit about the economics of it, how the British East India Company used a monopoly over Indian-produced opium and how they smuggled this product, this valuable product, in through the back door of Chinese commerce, and how this gave British merchants and the British East India Company a long desired balance of trade. And we talked a little bit, left off today talking about some of the health consequences, health impacts of opium consumption. And this was, for the sake of the Opium War, this became a leading public health concern. Large percentages of China's 300 billion population were falling under the influence and fell addicted to this very transformative narcotic, which really makes an individual of very limited use to society, and in fact makes them a drain upon society. And so we talked a little bit about some of the health symptoms and consequences of this, and I'm guessing you don't need too much help connecting the dots as to why this would be a concern of the Chinese emperor at the time. And let me just add that the tragedy of opium consumption did reach all the way into the family of the emperor of China. His son died. And that was actually, it was that overdose that really brought this issue home. It had been a concern in China before that, but in 1839, the emperor commissioned one of his ministers, his government officials, to formally write a letter to the British queen. This would have been Queen Victoria at that time. I think I have that right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Queen Victoria. Anyway, wrote this letter asking for Britain to cease and desist from trafficking opium into Great Britain, and it fell on deaf ears. The minister's name was Lin Zexu, and his efforts were not particularly effective. Moving on to the military aspects of the Opium War, really the Opium War provides some powerful symbolism. We know that the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Great Britain, which is one of the leading characters in the story of the Opium Wars, the Industrial Revolution was a transformation to iron and then steel, and that had tremendous impacts upon the technology of warfare. Here we have a ship which is one of many ships that served the British side in the Opium Wars, but the Nemesis was a really revealing new design that tells us actually a lot about the economy that produced it as well. First off, it was primarily iron, and it was propelled by steam, so we have two of the critical ingredients of the Industrial Revolution right there. It was designed very carefully to be successful in combat, naval combat, such as that which will prove necessary in the Opium Wars. For example, it's a fairly large ship, but it's a very shallow ship. It had, at most a 6-foot depth beneath the surface, and for a ship that's, 100 feet long or more, that's quite impressive. That's pretty shallow, and that proved to be really helpful because it allowed the Nemesis to get right close to shore as it was fighting. It allowed it to navigate rivers and waterways that allowed it to move into the interior of China, and this helped realize tremendous success for the British naval efforts. This ship actually wasn't labeled as an official part of the Navy. There was a real effort, since it was the British East India Company that was angry with Chinese trade policy. The British took special pains to keep the ships from appearing official in their capacity. Very agile boat. It did have cannons, but it also, probably more important, were the pivoting guns on the decks of the Nemesis, and some of these trade forts would surrender rather quickly upon the bombing bombardments that the Nemesis could bring upon these Chinese ports. It was a very easy military victory, really, for the Brits. Okay, and then let me close by talking about the politics. What were some of the things that changed in the relationship, the formal relationship between Great Britain and China? And later these same concepts are going to be extended not just to Great Britain, but other European countries as well. So treaty ports start to increase in their size and number after the First Opium War, which started in 1839. And what that means is more cities, more ports along the Chinese seaboard are going to be opened to foreign trade. Now, this was not something China chose. In fact, let me click this. Before this, there was the Canton system, and I mentioned this in class. Only one city in all of China was open to foreign trade. Well, because the British prevailed and because the British wanted greater access, they were able to insist upon treaty ports. So now, as a result of the Opium Wars, there will be numerous cities and ports along the seaboard, the eastern seaboard of China, that will be opened up to foreigners. Then there are settlements, and these were odd arrangements. These were small areas that were essentially, as I quote here, Chinese soil that was governed by foreigners. So Great Britain was able to insist upon stronger language and concessions that allowed for areas that were under greater control by European powers. This starts to sound a little bit like colonialism, and in fact it really was. And then there was a third level known as concessions, and concessions were parcels of land that were leased by foreign countries They were on Chinese soil, and the control and possession of these was so complete that the foreign governments that administered these concessions could even bar or prevent Chinese citizens from venturing into these areas. So these are all revealing of the fact that China is losing control and is really, it's a humiliating string of events. The final thing I will say is extraterritoriality. One of the really more important consequences of the Opium Wars is that Great Britain can now insist that when British citizens, British merchants, British government officials, whenever they are on Chinese soil, they are not subject to Chinese law. So the principle of extraterritoriality is that the laws of, in this case, Britain, extend beyond British boundaries and into foreign governments. You think about that, that's a sort of humiliating concession. Although the United States insists upon this in many cases today, a lot of our soldiers and our government officials have diplomatic immunity when they reside on foreign soil. So extraterritoriality is an important development that comes from this. British citizens will be very much at home, even in faraway places like China. All right, thank you.